Okay, welcome to today's lecture. Today we are taking a look at risk management. Risk management. Now, risk is usually associated with the possibility that things will go wrong. Okay, that events might turn out worse than expected, or that something bad might happen. That is simply risk. Okay, it also means that whenever there is a future outcome or future event, okay, it may not be predictable with certainty. Okay, and so a range of different possible outcomes or events might occur, to the outcome. All right, now generally risk can be divided into two. We have pure risk and speculative risk. Pure risk are risks that can often be controlled. So pure risk are often to be controlled either by means of putting in place internal controls or by taking insurance. Okay, typical examples of pure risk are controlled by establishing internal controls or taking insurance. Okay, so you can also call these risk internal control risk or operational risk. Then we have speculative risk, which cannot be avoided because the risk must be taken in order for the organization to make the necessary amount of profit. Now, as a general rule, the higher the risk, the higher the expected return. Okay, so if you are taking a high risk, there's the possibility that the returns are going to be high. And if you are taking a low risk, the possibility of making profits is quite low. Now, speculative risk are usually called business risk and might also be called strategic risk or enterprise risk. Now, within an organization, somebody or a group of persons must be responsible for the management of risk. That is for the management of both the upside of the risk and then the downside of the risk. And this actually lies on the lap of the directors or the board. Okay, so the responsibility for risk management is defined as the culture, structures, and the processes that are focused on achieving possible opportunities, yet at the same time controlling unwanted results. Okay, that is risk management. And it's the process of managing both the downside and the business risk, as we said. Now, the implementation and management of strategies should be aimed at achieving the stated objectives of the organization, but then at the same time should be able to manage the downside risk and also limit the business risk. So as you are targeting achieving the corporate objectives, you should also be aware of the management of the downside risk and also try and limit the business risk. Now, as I said earlier, the board of directors have direct responsibility for safeguarding the assets of the company and managing the risk of the organization. They should keep strategic risk within the limits set by the shareholders. Okay, and so they should avoid and control operational risk. All risk that the directors take should be within the limits or the risk appetite of the shareholders of the organization. Now, in an organization, there should always be a risk culture. There should be a culture of risk awareness. Okay, directors should develop a culture within the organization that will create the awareness of the risk within the organization. Okay, yeah. Managers and then employees should understand the risk appetite of the organization, the level of risk that the organization is prepared to take. so that the organization does not take excessive risk or involve itself in excessive business risk. Okay, there should be a system and processes for identifying the risk, first of all, assessing the magnitude of the risk, and then also what measuring the risk. These should be established within the organization, and that is the responsibility of the board of directors. Now, when risk have been measured, then you will be able to prioritize the risk. Okay, order the risk in terms of what priority, which one you would control first, followed by which one, and so on and so forth. There should always be an efficient system of communicating information about the risk, okay, and the risk management to both managers and the board of directors. So it should be a two-way affair. The communication should be a two-way affair, okay, from managers to board of directors, from board of directors to managers. Now, the strategies and risk should be monitored to ensure that the strategic objectives are being achieved within acceptable limits of risk. And within an organization, or some organizations would set up a risk committee, which is a board committee, okay, a committee of the board, which is responsible for risk management. Okay, so a risk management committee of executives should be a source of information and advice or recommendations for the board. They are responsible for identifying and assessing risk and reporting to the board of directors. Okay, the committee may also be responsible to formulate possible business risk management strategies. Okay, so they can recommend it to the board. Okay, they also have the responsibility to agree on programs for the design and implementation of internal controls in order to control the operational risk the organization faces. They are also responsible to monitor the effectiveness of risk management throughout the organization. This includes business risk and the control of internal risk. Okay, so that is the responsibility or the function of the risk committee. But the overall responsibility lies with the board of directors. Now let's look at some more specific types or categories of risk. So we have market risk, which is the risk that occurs, okay, that happens when there is changes in market price of key items, okay? So market prices of items can go up or can come down, and that can benefit the company or rob the company of its profits, right? There's also credit risk. Credit risk is the risk of losses from bad debt, okay? And this is especially well seen in financial institutions who give out loans and other financial instruments. Okay, so when there is the risk of bad debt or delay by customers to pay their loans, then there's a risk of what? Credit or credit risk. Now, all companies that give credit to customers are exposed to credit risk. Technological risk are risks that could arise from changes in technology, especially when there is an introduction of new technology into the business space. Okay, so when a major technological change occurs, then companies might decide to respond by adopting the technology or ignoring the technology. And either way, there is a risk. Okay, there is a risk. We also have legal risk, which is the risk of losses arising from failure to comply with laws and regulations, and also the risk of losses from legal actions and lawsuits. Okay, and then remember that regulatory risks are also part of legal risk. Then there is health, safety, and environment risk. There's the risk to the health and safety of the employees, customers, and the general public. Okay, the environment within which the organization operates. All right. Then also there's reputation risk. It is a risk that the company's reputation with the general public, including customers, okay, or the reputation of its product or brand will suffer some level of damage because of the operations of the organization. Okay, so for instance, if an organization operates by using minors, then the organization faces a reputation risk. Or an organization that is engaged in illegalities would definitely have what? Be faced with reputation risk. Then there is business probity risk. Business probity means being honest, means honesty and integrity. So things like corruption would be found here under business probity risk. Okay, is the risk of losses from a failure to act in an honest way. In an honest way. Then finally, there is derivative risk, okay, which include derivatives include commodity derivatives and financial derivatives. So commodity derivatives are contracts on the price of commodities such as oil, gold, wheat, metal, coffee, and so on and so forth. Then we have financial derivatives, which are contracts on the price of certain financial instruments or market rates, such as foreign exchange rates, interest rates, prices of bonds, etc. Okay, so these are more specific types of risk that would be faced in an organization. Now, before you can manage any type of risk, it is important to first of all identify risk. In risk management, the foremost thing to do is to identify the risk. Okay, so we'll look at risk identification first in order to be able to manage risk. So a company needs to understand what risk it faces, okay, both in its environment and the markets, okay. So once they know what risk is faced, then they should be able to what? Identify the particular or the specific risk that it faces, okay. There are no standard rules about how risk should be identified. Usually in a large organization, it might be more appropriate to identify risk at different levels in the organization on a group-wide basis and for each business division, especially if it is a divisionalized organization, and for each department of the division. So for each organization, you should look at identifying risk at the highest level possible. That is dealing with all the groups or group members or the divisions. Then within each division, you should be able to identify risk within its department, functional department. Okay. Now, management might be responsible for identifying strategic risk or business risk for the company. But then also within the organization, there are internal auditors or even their external auditors may be more efficient at identifying operational risk. Okay. And then they may suggest suitable internal controls measures to mitigate these risks. Okay, so senior management can focus on business risk and then the strategic risk so that the internal risk, which includes the internal control risk, should be identified by the internal and the external auditors. Okay. And as we said earlier, large companies often will set up risk management committees or risk committees. Okay, and these are committees of managers from several departments or functions within the organization. And each committee is responsible for reporting on a particular category of risk or risk in a particular geographical area of the company's operations. Okay. Now, risks that are identified by an organization will vary in importance. Okay, several or levels of importance or priorities will be attached to the risks that are identified. Some risk might be unimportant or easily controlled. Okay, some risk will be very, very significant. And then once you have identified this risk, it is necessary to assess the importance of each of those risks. And this you do in order to rank the risk in order of significance or in order of priority. And then identify the risks that are the most significant. And finally, identify the significant risk where control measures are urgently needed, right? So that you can control them to avoid unexpected occurrences. Now, control measures are only justified if the cost of the control measures is less than the benefit obtained from reducing the risk. So that if you have to put in place controls and the cost of putting in place those controls is far higher than the benefit obtained when you reduce the risk, then there is no need to put in place that particular risk because it is even going to cost the company more. So this has to be taken into consideration when controlling risk in an organization. So in identifying the risk facing an organization, it's important both strategic risk and operational risk are controlled or identified. However, the risk for a company also creates risk for its stakeholders. So it doesn't end there that risk faced by a company will affect the company only. It also has a way of affecting its stakeholders. So it's important management are aware of the impact of the company's risk on stakeholders, because the risk for stakeholders could affect the attitude and behavior of stakeholders towards the company. Okay, and so that can even define um, the progress and the achievement of the organization's strategies. Okay, now some of these stakeholders will include employees within the organization, which are internal stakeholders, investors, who are external stakeholders, creditors, community and the general public, customers, business partners, and even government. Now, for employees are exposed to several risks in their job. Okay, this includes the risk of loss of job and the threat to health or safety in the workplace. Okay, now employment benefits might be threatened when the organization takes certain high levels of risk. Okay, now these risks to employees can be affected by risks that the company faces. Jobs may be threatened, especially, for instance, if the company is going to be acquired by another organization. Okay, if the company makes wrong strategic decisions, it can affect employees' benefits and even the safety of their jobs. Okay, safety risk for a company might be measured in terms of the risk of serious injuries and minor injuries to employees over a given period of time. Okay. Then with the investors, remember that when investors buy the shares of a company, they have some expectation of the sort of company it is, the returns they might expect from their investments. Okay. So for example, an investor might buy shares in a company expecting it to be high-risk company, which could achieve a very high rate of growth in the share price. Okay. Or an investor might even buy shares in a company because the company is stable and can be expected to pay regular dividends. Now, it is essential that the board of directors of such companies ensure that the risk appetite of the company is consistent with the risk appetite of shareholders, because shareholders take this into consideration before they invest in the organization. Companies should not expose themselves to strategic risks that will expose investors to a risk of them losing their investments. Okay, shouldn't take excessive risk beyond what investors are prepared to take. It's also important that when a company increases its exposure to strategic risk, many existing shareholders might decide to sell their shares and leave. Okay, so the board of directors should keep shareholders informed about the significant risk that the company faces so that the investors can decide on their own whether to stay with the company or move, sell their shares and move. With creditors' main risk to a company's um, the main risk to a company's creditors and suppliers from the company's risk would include that the company will not pay what they owe in terms of their loans, and then the company will stop buying goods and services from them. Okay, a high risk company is often a high credit risk or a company that has high credit risk. The liquidity risk and insolvency risk facing a company has an impact on the credit risk for a supplier or a lender. And so when a company asks a bank for a loan, the bank will assess the credit status of the company and will make the decision to lend on the basis of whether it thinks the company will be able to pay back the loan and in time with interest, right? So these assessments would be made before the loans are given out. Then with the community and the general public, we understand that general public would include the risk to the general public will include the consequences for the country of a decline in the business activities and profits of a company due to recession, especially when the company is a major employer. Okay. It also includes health and safety risk from failures by a company to supply goods that meet with health and safety standards. Okay. Now, risk to local community also arise from economic risk faced by the company. Okay. Then for government, we realize that companies are a source of economic wealth for the country and the government. They create additional economic activity, which in turn creates extra wealth, and they provide employment and tax revenue for government. Now, a risk for government is that major companies will decide to invest in a different country or move their operations out of the country if they find out that there are some kind of political risk that they are unable to bear. They can leave, and that poses a risk. That poses a major risk. Okay. Then for customers, a company might face operational risk from human error or system breakdown in its operations. This happens often, especially when you go to the banks. Errors and delays in providing goods and services have an impact on business customers. Okay, for example, if a company is late in supplying a key component to a business customer, the customer will be late in supplying its own customers. Okay. And finally, for business partners, there's a risk in joint ventures. Okay, when they decide or partners put themselves together to set up a joint venture. Okay, the company in a joint venture might try to dominate decision making in order to reduce the risk that the joint venture will not operate in the way that they want it to operate. Okay, risk in partnership can be controlled for all the partners to some extent by clear terms in the contract agreement between the partners and by monitoring performance of the partnership. Now, after risk has been identified, it is important that you assess the level of risk, the impact of the risk, okay? And then the probability of occurrence of the risk. That is what we are going to look at now, the impact and probability. Okay. Now, the assessment of risk can also be called risk profiling or risk mapping. Okay, now to assess each risk, it is necessary to consider the likelihood that losses will occur as a consequence of the risk. Once you are taking risk, you have to consider the likelihood of the losses that would occur. and even the size or amount of the losses when it actually happens. You have to be able to make an assessment of that. To be able to do this, you can use a 2x2 matrix, okay, where you have the impact or the size of potential loss against the probability or frequency of the risk happening, okay. And so if you have a low probability or frequency of the risk happening, and then a low impact, then for such a risk, you have to review it periodically. You have to review it periodically. If the probability or frequency of the risk of the risk happening is quite high, but then the impact is low, then you have to consider the need for what? Control action. Now, when the risk or the probability or frequency of the risk materializing is low, but then the impact is quite high, then you need to consider control measures such as insurance, taking external insurance. Then finally, when the frequency of the risk materializing, the possibility or probability of the risk materializing with a very high impact, then it is important you take an immediate action in order to control the risk. Okay, so this is how the impact and probability assessment is made, so that once you're able to categorize and know where it is, then you know how to manage it so that things do not get out of hand. Now, the risk assessment must be an ongoing activity. It shouldn't be done once. It should be ongoing. It should be reviewed from time to time. Whenever possible, risk should be measured so targets can be set for maximum risk tolerance. Okay? And then also to be able to measure actual performance against the target. Now, within a system of risk management, it is important to recognize that companies need to establish a process for deciding which risks are tolerable, which risks they can tolerate, and which risks need more control measures in order to reduce them. Okay, now to do this, you can establish a risk dashboard, okay, which you can use to identify the risks that need further control measures. Okay, each risk in a dashboard is represented by a color coding. So you can have red, amber, and then green, where green will indicate low risk, amber will indicate medium risk, and then red will indicate high risk. Now, when risk has a red light, this indicates that further risk measures are needed or are required. A green light indicates that the risk is under control, and then an amber light indicates that the risk needs to be kept under review to make an assessment whether it has to be controlled immediately or it can be delayed. Okay. Now, we earlier indicated that the board of directors have the ultimate responsibility for the management of risk. Now, the management of the organization also share in this responsibility. Their responsibility is to identify the key risk, okay, facing the organization. Although the board might take on the responsibility with advice from management and auditors. So the ultimate responsibility lies with the board, but practically it is managers who should help the board to identify key risk. And then also their external auditors can also help in this regard. Okay, assessing risk is another responsibility for management. Okay, they should make an assessment of risk in order for them to be able to design and implement risk control measures. They're also responsible for monitoring the effectiveness of risk controls and then keeping risk under review. Finally, they are also responsible for reporting regularly to the board of directors on risk and risk management. So these are the responsibilities of managers in as far as the identification of risk and their assessment is concerned. Then the board itself has an overall responsibility for risk management, okay, and for the establishment of systems of internal control in the organization. The board should set the company's risk and give clear guidance on the company's risk appetite based on the risk appetite of its shareholders. The board should also conduct a review at least once a year on the effectiveness of internal controls. All right. And they should report to shareholders at the AGM, okay, on the outcome of the review of internal control. These are important. Now, within an organization, you can have a role for an officer, okay, who would be called or termed the risk manager. And you can appoint several risk managers who will be responsible for several kinds of risk, okay, including insurance risk, health and safety risk, information system and information technology risk, human resource risk, financial risk or treasury risk, and then compliance risk. So within an organization, you can have all these sorts of risk managers, okay? Now, these risk managers often are not the regular line managers, and they are not directly responsible for risk management. Emphasis is on directly. They are not directly responsible. The responsibility lies with the board of directors. Okay. The role of the risk manager is simply to provide information, assist, and advise management. Okay. And to improve risk awareness within the organization, and also encourage the adoption of sound risk management practices. These are their roles. Okay. So mainly helping with identification of risk, establishing tools to help with the identification of risk. So they go into the nitty-gritties of establishing the tools, criteria that would help to identify the risk. They are also responsible for establishing modeling methods for the assessment and measurement of risk. As we said earlier on, it's important you assess the risk and then measure the risk so that you can prioritize them. They're also responsible for collecting risk incident reports so that when an incident happens, he is the one who would report it. So if there's an accident, he ensures that the accident is reported. Okay. He's also responsible for assisting heads of department and other line managers in the review of reports by internal auditors. Okay. He's also responsible for preparing regular risk management reports for senior management or the risk committee, if there is one in the organization. And then finally, he is responsible for monitoring best practices in risk management and encouraging the adoption of best practices in the organization. Now, a little bit light on the role of the risk committees. We've already mentioned that some organizations, especially the bigger ones, would have risk committees, which is a committee of the board of directors. And as we mentioned earlier, this committee is responsible for fulfilling the corporate governance obligations of the board. Okay. The committee might be an interdepartmental committee where membership is drawn from different departments of the organization. Okay. Now, it is clearly this risk committee does not have management authority to make decisions on the control of risk. Okay, their main function is to identify, monitor, and report on the effectiveness of risk management to the board or senior management. Okay. It is possible that internal auditors and risk managers might even be included in this committee. Okay. And it is the duty of the board to request for regular reports from the committee as part of their governance function in order to monitor the effectiveness of risk management systems that have been put in place. Now, risk in an organization should be monitored. Okay, the purpose of risk monitoring is to ensure that there are processes and procedures for identifying risk, and that these processes and procedures are working effectively. Okay, there are internal controls and other risk management processes in place for managing the risk. That's another role of risk auditing, or the importance of risk auditing. Okay, then also risk management systems, they have to ensure that, or it ensures that risk management systems are effective. Then the level of risk faced by the entity is consistent with the policies on risk that are set by the board of directors. Failures in the control of risk are identified and investigated. And then finally, weaknesses in risk management processes are identified and corrected. Now, in the management or in risk auditing, there are 4 key stages in auditing risk. In risk auditing, they include identification of the risk, assessment of the risk, review of the risk, and then reporting the outcome of the audit. Now, with identification, this means that identifying what the risks are in the first place and in a particular situation, which situation is the risk, the strategy, and then the procedure or system. Now, remember, risk also change continually in nature. Okay, existing risks may disappear after some time, and the new risk will emerge. So it is important to identify which risks are current, Then after identification, the next thing to do is to assess the probability of an adverse event or outcome happening, and then the impact of the assessment, which we talked about previously. Now, the loss that would come out of this assessment is a probability, it's a function of the probability and then the impact. Okay, so if the probability is high and then the impact is high, then the risk of losses will be high. If the probability is low and then the impact is low, then the risk of losses will be low. Okay, so if you want to quantify it, then it has to be the use of this formula, the probability multiplied by the impact. Then you'll be able to quantify the loss arising from the risk happening. After this, then you have to review, okay, or taking a relook at the controls that are in place to manage the risk in the event that an adverse outcome happens. The management of the organization may have taken measures to transfer the risk or to reduce the risk by introducing monitoring and control systems. The controls for each material identified risk should be audited. And finally, a report would have to be put together on this auditing, okay, and then sent to the board of directors or to management. Okay. We earlier mentioned that it is important to create risk or the awareness of risk in an organization. But how important is that? Okay. Now, managers take decisions that often will expose the entity to different types of risk. Okay, they need to understand the possible consequences of their decision. Okay, and they should be satisfied that the risk they have created or have taken are justified by the expected benefits which would come out of the decision they have made. Okay, senior managers, as we said, are responsible for the management of business risk or strategic risk. And every employee in the organization needs to be aware of the need to contain operational risk. For example, for a manufacturer of food products, a failure in food hygiene regulations could have serious consequences for both public health and the company's reputation. Okay? All employees must be aware of the health and safety regulations and comply with them. A failure to comply with these health and safety regulations could result in serious fire or damage in parts of or even all of the organization. Okay? Employees and managers should understand the need to report incidents where they have been excessively exposed to risk and control measures have failed to counter these risks. In some entities, there could be serious consequences of failure to comply with regulations and procedures. It could even lead to the dismissal of the employee or the manager involved. Now, one key thing that the board of directors and senior management should do is to ensure that risk is embedded in the organization's culture. First of all, the board of directors and senior managers are responsible for creating the organization's culture. And they are also responsible for ensuring that risk is integrated into the organization's culture. Okay? So risk awareness is embedded in the culture of the organization when the thinking about risk and the control of risk is a natural thing and a regular part of the employee's behavior. Once this is natural and regular, then you can say that risk has been embedded in the organization. And thus, like I said, is the responsibility of what the board of directors and senior management. Okay, to do this, there should be a reporting system for disclosing risk-related issues. Managers' employees should disclose information about risk and failures in risk control. Okay, there should be the recognition that problems should not be kept hidden. Employees and managers should have this recognition that bad news should be reported as soon as it is identified for control measures to be taken. Okay, there must be openness and transparency. Okay, individuals should not be criticized for making mistakes, provided that they own up to them promptly. And then finally, the attitude should be that problems with risk will always occur. Okay, problems with risk will always occur. This should be understood by all. When they do happen, the objective should be to take measures to deal with the problem. Mistake should be analyzed in order to find solutions and prevent a repetition of the problem. And risk management should be a constructive process, not a destructive event. Now, there are several methods of controlling risk in an organization, which we often call the TARA framework. Okay, the TARA framework. Okay, so we have diversification as a method of controlling risk. Okay, or spreading risk so that it will reduce the effect or the impact of the risk when it so happens. So the purpose of diversification in business is to invest in a range of different business activities and build up a portfolio of different business activities. So you can invest in football, invest in education, invest in oil and gas, invest in food and beverages. These are different areas or different business activities. And so once you put your investment in that portfolio, you are deemed to have diversified the risk so that if something happens to the soccer industry, it will only affect the soccer business and not the other businesses. If something happens to oil and gas, it doesn't happen to the rest of them. So in that case, you are managing the downside of the risk. Okay. Now, each business activity is risky, by the way. Okay. So these activities or business activities would have different levels of risk. Now, taking the entire portfolio of different businesses, the good performance will offset the bad performance. So this is the idea. And so the portfolio as a whole might provide on average the expected returns. It won't be affected significantly overall. Okay. Now, it is not always easy to do diversification. Okay. It is a very high risk oftentimes. And so before you can diversify as an organization or as management, it's important that you need to have the skills and an experience to be able to manage these portfolios that you are taking on. Okay, you should have the skills and experience to manage them. Okay, now if shareholders approve it, then of course you can go ahead and do that. Now, a diversification strategy by a company is much more risky. Each business is very different from the others. And that's why we said you need to have the skills and experience to manage them. Okay, if you can't do that, then allow the the investors themselves to decide where to put their investment, where to diversify into. Okay. Now, risks are reduced significantly. Risk is not reduced by diversifying into different activities with the risk. So in the event adverse change in one business activity, if there's an adverse change in one business activity, there's a strong probability that adverse changes will also occur in the other activities, especially if these business activities are essentially not too different. So for example, or if these businesses are within the same industry. So for example, a company that diversify into house building, manufacturing windows, and manufacturing bricks would be exposed in all three businesses to conditions in the housing market. So this is not a well diversified portfolio because all these businesses are within the same market or sector. Oh. Then risk can also be transferred. Okay, risk can be transferred, and this involves passing some or all of a risk onto another person so that they also bear the exposure to the risk. A common example of risk transfer is often given as what? Insurance, taking an insurance. Okay, so you have a vehicle, you've taken an insurance, or you're taking a life insurance or a building insurance, and so on and so forth. Okay, now using insurance to manage risk is appropriate for risks where the potential losses are high, but the probability of a loss occurring is fairly low. Okay, so that when it happens, it will not have a great impact on the organization's profits. Then you can talk about risk sharing, which involves collaborating with another person, okay, in order to share the risk jointly. And the commonest example is entering into a joint venture. Now, in a joint venture, all partners share in the investment. So they all bring their monies into the investment. They share in the management. Okay, yeah, they co-manage or they jointly manage the investment. Okay, the cost of the investment is borne by all of them, and then the risk and rewards are shared by all of them. Okay, so that is what risk sharing. Now, companies pursuing a strategy of developing their business in other countries might use joint venture as a way of entering the market in a different country. So they enter into a joint ventureship with the local people or the local investors. For the global company that is seeking to invest in that local country or in that country, the joint venture partner would be a local business whose management have knowledge of the local market. So that is an advantage over there for the global company. And then for a local business, a joint venture with a foreign company reduces financial risk and also improves the opportunities for expansion and growth into other countries. Then there is hedging risk. Hedging means creating a position that offsets, okay, an exposure to another risk. So you put yourself in a position or in a transaction that will offset the risk that is coming from another exposure or from another activity. For example, if an exposure to currency risk will mean losing money if the US dollars or the foreign currency falls against the euro, a hedge can be created. Okay, you take a position when the company will make a profit if the US dollar falls in the value or in value against the euro. Okay, the loss on the original risk exposure will be offset by a gain on the hedge position. So if the US dollar falls and you are going to make a loss, you would have taken or you would have hedged the risk so that on that side you will gain, so that it will offset the loss you would make, sorry, the loss you would incur when the US dollar falls. Now, risk can be hedged with a variety of derivative instruments, such as futures, options, swaps, and so on and so forth. We'll look at this in our future topics. Now, you can take measures to control risk that happens or that will happen, such as taking a hedge risk or hedging a risk, risk sharing, risk transfer, or diversification. You can take a risk, a control. Okay. Now, these controls that you put in place to manage these risks would not eliminate the risk altogether. It is only going to manage it, which means that there will still be an exposure. You will still have some level of exposure, okay, after managing these risks. Okay, that is what we refer to as residual risk. Okay, it is the risk that remain after risk control measures have been implemented or put in place. The remaining risk is what is called residual risk. Now, an entity needs to develop a strategy towards these risks. The basic choice is between risk avoidance and risk retention. Either you avoid the risk or you retain the risk. Now, risk avoidance means not having any exposure to a risk, meaning that you are not ready to even be in business. Okay? If there is exposure in the market, you pull out of the market. If there's exposure in the business, you pull out of the business. This means that you are avoiding the risk. And that also means that you are putting yourself in a position where you will not make any profit or make any benefit because you are pulled out of the market. Okay, that is risk avoidance. Then there is risk retention, which means accepting the risk. Okay, you boldly accept the risk, you go in there, invest, and then you are sure to make some returns. Okay, now when risks are retained, they should be managed to ensure that unnecessary risks are not taken. The fact that you have accepted the risk does not mean you should just open up yourself to more risk. You should also put in place measures to control the exposure to the risk. Okay, all right. And finally, we'll talk about enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management. Now, many companies have established an enterprise-wide risk management. So this is where there is an overall awareness and consciousness to manage risk in the entire organization. Okay, so that the approach to risk management is consistent throughout the company or the group, if it is a group. Okay, So all through the organization, all through the departments, all through the functions of the organizations, all through the activities of the organization, there's a certain risk management position that has been taken. And this is what we call enterprise risk management. It's an enterprise-wide risk management framework. Okay. Now, risk management should start with understanding how stakeholders measure value. How do stakeholders, especially shareholders, measure value? Framework for risk management might be applied 3 levels or 3 stages, including establishing the approach to risk management and creating a risk management vision. Secondly, committing resources to risk management and ensuring infrastructure for risk management is in place and the company has the capabilities and skills for managing those risks. Then finally, implementing systems for risk assessment, the applications of controls and other management systems for risk, and monitoring risk and the effectiveness of risk. Now, this is the risk framework for managing risk as far as enterprise risk management is concerned. We'll take a look at the picture. And these are the 4 stages. Stage 1, stage 2, sorry, the 3 stages, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. So stage 1 is where you have risk management vision. Okay, stage 2, you have risk infrastructure and risk capabilities. Stage 3, you have risk assessment, risk treatment, and risk monitoring. So this is where there's actual implementation. Stage 2 is the resources that the organization has. And then stage 1 is the approach. Okay. So the overall approach to risk management should be established by senior management. Overall approach should be established by senior management. The company should have a clear risk strategy. This should be well defined and communicated throughout the organization for both managers and employees. There should be a culture of risk management. There should be a culture of risk management which is consistent. Okay, there should be consistent definition, or the consistent definition should be used throughout the company, providing appropriate and simple terminology to support the risk management process. Then at the second stage, or the stage 2, where we have the resources, okay, there should be a risk management infrastructure, and then the organization should have what? Risk management capabilities. Okay, there should be a risk management structure which will provide leadership and support in the area of risk management and internal control. Okay, there should be appropriate risk management policies and procedures. Okay, there should be these policies and procedures should be kept up to date and should be readily available for managers and employees to access. And finally, appropriate risk management, specialist risk management should be there, and assurance functions should be established where appropriate. For example, capabilities in internal audit, health and safety management, IT assurance, insurance management, and environmental risk management functions. Okay. Then you have the risk capabilities, which are also resources that the organization should have. Okay, employees, the company should have the capabilities for managing risk, which might include employees being given structured training in basic risk management procedures and internal control systems. Okay, employees, the company should have the capabilities for managing risk, which might include individuals having personal objectives that make reference to their performance in areas of risk and control. Okay, and then systems, there should be systems capable of providing early warning signs of any major control breakdowns or problems happening. Okay. Then finally, we have the third stage, which is the risk management implementation phase. Okay, where you're looking at identifying the risk, profiling the risk, and measuring it, accountability and ownership for the risk. Okay, all under risk assessment. And then you have risk treatment, where controls should be designed to mitigate the risk. Okay, there should also be some form of testing controls for both their design and their operating effectiveness. Okay, and then finally, risk monitoring. Okay, risk should be monitored by managers who have the responsibility for those risks. In addition, risk can be monitored at a more senior level through the establishment of KPIs and key risk indicators. Okay. The board of directors should be provided regularly by management with clear reports on risk management and internal control, okay, such as reports on the company's risk profile, controlling testing, the results of those tests, and action plans resulting from test findings. All right, so this brings us to the end of the lecture on risk management.